At about 4 o'clock in the morning, on the 19th of August, 2024, a 56-meter sailing yacht, lying at anchor half a mile off the Sicilian coast, heeled over to 90 degrees and sank. The whole thing took a few minutes. 7 of the 22 people aboard died, including an 18-year-old girl. 2 years later, there are 2 official investigations into what happened, both serious, both staffed by experts, both looking at the same yacht and the same night. One of them says the boat had a vulnerability nobody aboard knew about, and that once the wind hit it in the configuration it was in, nothing anyone could have done would have saved it. The other says the weather that night was survivable, that the boat 200 meters away rode it out without significant damage, and that what sank Bayesian was what the people aboard did and did not do. Those 2 positions cannot both be right, and I am not going to pretend to resolve them for you, because they have not been resolved. What I can do is lay out exactly what each side has, where it comes from, and why 2 competent inquiries looking at one event have ended up this far apart. Some of what follows is contested. I will flag it every single time. Bayesian was a British-flagged sailing yacht built in 2008 by Perini Navi in Italy. 56 meters, about 184 feet. Her most distinctive feature was her rig, a single mast of around 75 meters, one of the largest aluminium masts ever built for a yacht. She had a lifting keel. Rather than a fixed fin, she had a centerboard that could be dropped down to increase her draft from roughly 4 meters to nearly 10, or raised to let her into shallower water. Lowering it puts weight much further down and makes the boat considerably harder to push over. Raising it does the opposite. That single detail is at the center of everything that follows. On the 14th of August, she sailed from Milazzo for a short cruise around the Aeolian Islands and the north coast of Sicily. 12 guests, 10 crew. The guests were there for a specific reason. Mike Lynch was a British software entrepreneur who had, 2 months earlier, been acquitted in a long-running fraud case in the United States. The trip was a celebration, and among the people aboard were figures who had been part of that fight. His lawyer Chris Morvillo and his wife Nada, and Jonathan Bloomer, who had given evidence, with his wife Judy. Lynch's wife Angela was aboard. So was their daughter Hannah, who was 18 and about to go to Oxford. The crew included a chef named Ricaldo Thomas, a Canadian Antiguan, who had been cooking on yachts for decades. The plan was to put the guests ashore on the 19th and take the boat to Naples for maintenance. On the 18th, Bayesian was anchored at Cefalù. The wind was getting up, and more was forecast, so the decision was made to move 25 miles west to Porticello, partly for shelter, partly because it made getting the guests ashore easier the next morning. At 24 minutes past 9 that evening, she anchored east of the main breakwater. Her centerboard was in the raised position. A short distance away, another sailing yacht was already anchored, the Sir Robert Baden-Powell, a much smaller vessel under a captain named Karsten Borner. Remember that boat. Both investigations do. Before I go further, where this comes from, the technical detail, the timeline, and the stability analysis come from the interim report published by the United Kingdom's Marine Accident Investigation Branch on the 15th of May 2025, along with the studies it commissioned from the Met Office and from the University of Southampton. The Italian side comes from reporting of leaked preliminary findings by experts appointed by the Public Prosecutor's Office in Termini Imerese, first surfaced by Sky News at the end of April 2026. Those findings have not been officially published. The prosecutor's office declined to comment on the leak. That distinction matters, and I will keep making it. One side of this story is a published government document, the other is a leak. They do not carry the same weight of certainty, and treating them as if they do would be dishonest in either direction. At around 3:57 in the morning, both Bayesian and the Sir Robert Baden-Powell began dragging their anchors in rapidly increasing wind. Dragging is exactly what it sounds like. The anchor stops holding, and the boat starts sliding across the seabed downwind. It is not in itself an emergency. It happens, and the response is to start engines and take control. Then, shortly after 4, the wind rose sharply. What arrived, according to the analysis the MAIB commissioned from the Met Office, was very probably a mesocyclonic thunderstorm, a rotating convective storm cell, carrying transient winds well in excess of 64 knots, and possibly considerably more at the surface. Bayesian went from upright to lying on her side at 90 degrees. The interim report puts that at under 15 seconds. 15 seconds is not enough time to do anything. It is not enough time to get to a companionway. For people asleep in cabins below the waterline on the side that went down, it is not enough time to wake up properly. There was no flooding inside the boat before that moment. None. The water came in over the starboard rails once she was over, and went straight down the internal stairwells. The MAIB's chief inspector at the time, Andrew Mole, put the crucial point plainly. Once the yacht had gone past about 70 degrees, the situation was irrecoverable. Not difficult, not dangerous. Over. 15 people got out, 6 passengers, the captain, and 8 crew. They got into a life raft, and they were helped by the crew of the Sir Robert Baden-Powell, who launched their own tender into that weather and went and got them. 7 did not get out. Mike Lynch, his daughter Hannah, Jonathan and Judy Bloomer, Chris and Nada Morvillo, and Ricaldo Thomas, the chef. 6 of them were found inside the hull. Now the first investigation. Because Bayesian was British flagged, the loss fell to the Marine Accident Investigation Branch. It is important to understand what the MAIB is and is not. Under the regulations it works to, the sole purpose of its investigation is preventing future accidents. It is explicitly forbidden from determining liability or apportioning blame. It does not decide who was at fault. It works out what happened so that it does not happen again. Its interim report came out in May 2025, and it went at the problem from the direction of physics. The MAIB commissioned the Wolfson unit at the University of Southampton to model Bayesian's stability in the configuration she was actually in that night. At anchor, engines available, sails furled, centerboard raised. The term you need is angle of vanishing stability. Every boat has one. It is the angle you can push a hull past before it stops wanting to spring back upright and starts wanting to keep going over. Push a boat to 50 degrees and it fights you. Push it past the vanishing angle and it helps you. In that configuration, sails away, centerboard up, Bayesian's angle of vanishing stability came out at 70.6 degrees. And the study found that a wind of 63.4 knots striking her on the beam, side on, in that configuration, could put her past it. That number is doing a lot of work, so let me be precise about what it is. It is a modeled threshold, not a measurement of what the wind actually did. What the weather analysis suggests actually arrived that night was in excess of 64 knots and possibly a good deal more. Which means, if the modeling is right, the wind that night was above the threshold at which that boat, in that state, goes over and does not come back. Then the report said the part that changed the conversation: every large yacht carries a stability booklet, a technical document approved by regulators that tells the captain what the boat can and cannot take. Bayesian's booklet described her maximum heel angle before flooding in a sudden gust or squall with her keel down. It contained nothing about that scenario with her keel up, nothing about sudden gusts at anchor, nothing about motoring with the centerboard raised and the sails stowed. The MAIB noted that the large yacht code in force when she was built in 2008 did not require that information. So the position the interim report leaves you in is this. The boat had a vulnerability in a completely normal operating configuration. That vulnerability was not in the document whose entire job is to tell the captain what the boat can take. The MAIB stated that it was not known to the owner or the crew, none of which is a finding of blame because the MAIB does not make those. But you can see immediately why it landed the way it did. The builder's response was emphatic. Giovanni Costantino, chairman of the Italian Sea Group, which owns Perini Navi, has said in multiple interviews that yachts of this type are effectively unsinkable, and has said the crew failed to follow basic procedures, including lowering the keel and securing hatches. The company has litigated hard over the reputational consequences of this case, including a reported claim against the captain, 2 crew, and the yacht's holding company, and separate legal action involving media organizations. I am reporting the company's stated position, which it has made publicly and repeatedly. I am not adopting it. There is one more thing about the wreck. In June 2025, after a salvage operation that cost millions and during which a specialist diver was killed, Bayesian was lifted from the seabed and landed ashore. The mast came up separately. The hull is now in Italian custody and has been under forensic examination since. Which brings us to the second investigation and to a completely different answer. The public prosecutor's office in Termini Imerese has been running a criminal inquiry since the sinking. Its purpose is the opposite of the MAIB's, not prevention, but legal responsibility. At the end of April 2026, findings from an expert panel commissioned by that office were reported by British media. They have not been officially released. According to that reporting, the prosecutor's meteorological expert characterized the weather that night as little more than a squall, a sharp, short-lived increase in wind speed of the kind that runs ahead of a thunderstorm. Dangerous, yes, but in principle manageable by a competent crew on a properly handled vessel. And their strongest single piece of evidence is not a calculation, it is a boat. The Sir Robert Baden-Powell was anchored in the same bay, in the same water, in the same storm, at the same hour. She was smaller. She dragged her anchor too. She rode it out without significant damage, and then her crew went out in it and pulled 15 people out of a life raft. That is a very hard fact to argue with, and it is the reason the Italian inquiry went where it went. On that basis, according to the reporting, the sinking is attributed to crew misjudgment of the conditions and to safety systems not being activated properly. Reporting has also indicated the inquiry is focused on the operational state of the lifting keel, which was raised, and on whether doors or hatches were open in a way that accelerated flooding once she went over. 3 men are under investigation: the captain, James Cutfield, a New Zealander, Tim Eaton, and Matthew Griffith. I want to be completely clear about their position, because this is where reporting on this case has repeatedly gone wrong. They have not been charged. Prosecutors have been reported as weighing potential charges, including negligent shipwreck and multiple counts of manslaughter, but as of the most recent information available, no formal charges have been brought. Under Italian criminal procedure, being placed under investigation does not imply guilt and does not mean that charges will follow. All 3 are entitled to the presumption of innocence, and I am extending it to them without reservation. I am also not going to run the other theories. In the weeks after the sinking, there was a wave of speculation about foul play, fed by the fact that Mike Lynch had just won a major legal fight and that a co-defendant of his had died in a road accident days earlier. Neither the MAIB nor the Italian prosecutors has found a single piece of evidence pointing to external interference or sabotage. That is where that ends. So how do 2 serious investigations look at one sinking and disagree this completely? Partly because they are asking different questions. The MAIB asks, what characteristics of this vessel and this system allowed this to happen, so we can stop it happening to the next boat? The prosecutors ask, did a specific person do something a reasonable person in their position should not have done? Those questions can have different answers about the same night, without either party being incompetent, partly because of what each is willing to lean on. The MAIB's case rests on commissioned modeling of the yacht's stability. The prosecutor's case rests substantially on the observed behavior of another yacht in the same bay. And here is the thing that keeps the argument alive. Both of those can be true simultaneously. If Bayesian genuinely had an angle of vanishing stability of 70.6 degrees with her keel up and her sails away, and if a squall that a small ketch could ride out was enough to push her past it, then the weather being survivable for one boat and lethal for the other is not a contradiction. It is the finding, the counter, which the prosecutor's side presses, is that a competent crew would have lowered the keel and closed the boat up when a squall line was coming, and that not doing so is the failure regardless of what the booklet did or did not say. The counter to that counter is the booklet itself. If the approved document that tells you what your boat can take does not warn you that your boat becomes vulnerable in a configuration you use routinely, on what basis is a captain supposed to know? That is the argument. It has run for 2 years, it is being fought in Italian courts and in international media and in defamation actions, and it is not over. The MAIB's final report is still pending. It has said it will not conclude until investigators have examined the salvaged wreck and until the Italian criminal process allows access to further evidence. There is no date. If anything has moved since I put this together, check the current position rather than take my word for it. That is the honest instruction for a story that is still running. There is a version of this story that is entirely about money. A billionaire, a super yacht, a lawsuit for hundreds of millions, a builder, and a captain in a fight neither can afford to lose. That is not what happened at Porticello. Ricaldo Thomas was the chef. He had spent decades cooking on other people's boats, which is a job done in a small hot space below decks, while everyone above you is having the time of their lives. And by every account, he was very good at it, and very well liked. He was the crew member who died. Hannah Lynch was 18 years old. She had finished school. She had a place at Oxford. She was on a boat with her mother and father celebrating the fact that the worst years of her family's life were finally over. The people who got out because a man on another yacht 200 meters away looked at what was happening, in that weather, in the dark, and put a boat in the water and went. 15 came home because of that. 7 did not, and 2 years on, the question of why is still being argued about by people who were not there.